The night air over the North Atlantic was so cold it burned the lungs, a sharp contrast to the sweltering heat of the makeshift memorial service that would be held years later in a quiet Virginia suburb. But for her, the cold was a familiar friend. She had been swimming against icy currents since she was a girl, driven by a ghost she could never quite outrun. Her name was Jenna Blake, and on the surface, she was an unremarkable logistics officer, someone whose job was to sit behind a desk and move paper. The men at the Norfolk Naval Base barely glanced her way, seeing only the neat uniform and the quiet demeanor of a support staffer. They didn't see the slight calluses on her palms from the rope climbs at 3 a.m. They didn't notice the way her eyes constantly swept a room, cataloging exits and threats out of pure habit. And they had no idea that Jenna Blake was one of the most highly trained special operations officers in the United States military, a woman who had endured the infamous basic underwater demolition SEAL training, a gauntlet designed to break the strongest of men. Her journey to that freezing deck had begun not with a desire for glory, but with a debt. Years earlier, her older brother Liam had been the golden boy. A star athlete and natural leader, he had breezed through SEAL training and been selected for the most clandestine of units, a group officially referred to as the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, but known to the world as SEAL Team 6. Jenna worshipped him. When he was home on leave, he would take her running on the beach, timing her sprints, teaching her how to tie knots in the dark. "You've got the mindset, Jenna girl," he'd tell her, ruffling her hair. "Never let anyone tell you different just because you're a girl. It's about the head, not the body." She had believed him, but she never imagined following his path. She was headed for college, a normal life, while Liam headed back into the shadows. Then the notification team arrived at her parents' door. Liam's helicopter had been shot down over the Hindu Kush Mountains in Afghanistan. He was gone. The official language was sterile, but the grief was a physical wound that refused to heal. At his funeral, Jenna looked at the rows of stoic, granite-faced men in dress uniforms, his teammates. They spoke of his bravery, his sacrifice, but as she shook their hands, she felt a strange disconnect. They were heading back. They would continue the fight. She was being left behind with a folded flag. And in that moment, a cold, hard resolve crystallized in her chest. She wouldn't just mourn Liam, she would become him. She would carry his weight. The path she chose was one for which there was no playbook. When Jenna enlisted, women were officially barred from frontline combat roles, let alone the SEALs. But the intelligence community and special operations had long realized that modern warfare required a different kind of operator, someone who could blend in, gather intelligence in places men couldn't go, and interact with local populations in ways that a male soldier never could. Jenna was recruited for a program so black it didn't have a name. Her training was a hybrid nightmare, the physical brutality of BUD/S, where she dragged logs through the freezing surf until her muscles screamed and the instructors screamed louder, mixed with the psychological intensity of CIA tradecraft. She learned to be a ghost. She could shoot a target at 800 yards with a sniper rifle, then slip into a burqa and navigate a crowded market in Islamabad without drawing a single eye. She was an operative who didn't exist, a weapon the enemy never saw coming. Her cover as a lowly logistics officer was her final and most critical piece of training. It was the ultimate test of humility for a killer. Every day, she saluted men who were less capable, fetched coffee for officers who would never know her real name, and listened to them talk about sports while she mentally replayed combat drills. She was the invisible woman, and she was perfect. The mission, when it finally came, was the kind that kept the president's national security advisor awake at night. A high-value target. A terrorist financier known as the pharmacist had been tracked to a heavily fortified compound in the mountains of a contested region. He was responsible for funding the attacks that had killed Liam and countless others. But the compound was a fortress, ringed by lookouts and accessible only by a single exposed switchback road. A conventional raid, even by SEAL Team 6, would be a bloodbath. The element of surprise was impossible. They needed a way in. They needed a Trojan horse. Jenna's handler, a man she knew only as Control, laid out the impossible scenario on a secure monitor. The only person who could get close to the compound without raising suspicion was a local aid worker. A woman. And Jenna Blake, with her language skills, her survival training, and her innocuous cover, was the only woman they had. The plan was audacious to the point of insanity. Jenna would be activated from her logistics role with a fabricated family emergency. She would travel to a nearby country where she would assume the identity of Sarah Harding, a Canadian nurse working for a small, legitimate NGO. From there, she would orchestrate a medical emergency in a village near the target's compound. Her reputation for helping locals would spread, and the goal was to get the pharmacist's family, or one of his men, to request her services. She would walk through the front door with a medical bag full of equipment. But the medical bag would have a false bottom. Hidden beneath the bandages and syringes would be a small, powerful beacon. Her job was to place it somewhere inside the compound, and a device that would paint a laser target for an airstrike or guide in a follow-on assault team. It was a one-way trip. If she was discovered, there would be no rescue, no prisoner exchange. She would be on her own, deep in enemy territory, surrounded by the men who had killed her brother. Control gave her 24 hours to decide. She didn't need one. "Tell me when and where," she said, her voice as flat and cold as the North Atlantic ice. The village of Mirkani was a desperate smattering of mud brick houses clinging to a rocky hillside, a place the 21st century had forgotten. For 3 weeks, Jenna, now Sarah Harding, had lived among them. She slept on a dirt floor, treated children for parasites, and listened to the women gossip as they ground wheat. She was good at this. Her Pashto, polished by years of intense training, was passable. And her gentle, unassuming demeanor disarmed everyone she met. She spoke of her fictional life in Canada, her fictional family, her fictional reasons for being here. She became a part of the village's fabric, a quiet, kind stranger who asked no questions and offered only help. At night, she would lie on her thin mat and listen to the distant sound of generators from the compound a mile up the mountain, the nerve center of the man she was sent to find. She felt the weight of the beacon, sewn into the lining of her worn-out backpack, press against her spine. The break came not from the compound, but from the village. A young boy, the son of the local mullah, fell from a wall and suffered a deep, ugly gash on his leg that turned septic. His fever raged for days. Jenna knew that without proper antibiotics, he would die. She treated him aggressively, staying by his side through the nights, cleaning the wound, forcing him to drink water. The mullah, a man who had initially looked at her with suspicion, watched her tireless work with a new respect. On the 3rd day, the boy's fever broke. The mullah called her a blessing from God. That evening, a hardened man with a curled beard and an AK-47 slung across his back appeared at her small shelter. He was one of the pharmacist's bodyguards. The mullah's son was also his nephew. The man's own wife was suffering from a difficult pregnancy, and the local midwife was useless. The doctors in the city were too far. Would the Canadian nurse come? Jenna's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of calm concern. She gathered her bag, the one with the precious, deadly cargo, and followed him up the mountain. The compound was even more imposing up close, walls of reinforced concrete, watchtowers at every corner, men with hard eyes and restless fingers on their triggers. As she was led through the heavy wooden gate, Jenna's training took over. She was a camera, a computer, a recording device disguised as a woman. She counted the guards, 12 visible, identified the fields of fire from the towers, noted the location of the communications antenna, the reinforced door to the main building, the kennel of snarling dogs. She was led to a small, sparse room where a young woman lay sweating on a cot, writhing in pain. Jenna pushed all thoughts of the mission aside and became a nurse. She examined the woman, felt the position of the baby, and realized it was breech. The situation was critical, and she would need to perform a version, a risky manual manipulation to turn the baby, or both mother and child would die. She asked for hot water, clean cloths, and privacy. Reluctantly, the bodyguard and the other women left. For the next 2 hours, Jenna fought for the life of this woman, the wife of a terrorist. As she worked, her hands steady, her voice calm, she let her eyes roam the room. It was sparse, but it had a small, ornate wooden chest in the corner, a family treasure chest. It was perfect. When the baby finally crowned, a healthy, screaming boy, the room flooded with women and relief. In the chaos of joy, the celebration, the prayers of thanks, Jenna acted. She palmed the beacon, no bigger than a deck of cards, from the false bottom of her bag. Amid the hugs and tears, she knelt by the wooden chest, pretending to retrieve a fresh blanket. With a flick of her wrist, she slid the beacon into a gap between the ornate carvings and the chest's inner lining. It was magnetized. It would hold. She activated it with a tiny, almost imperceptible press of her fingernail against a concealed button. The deed was done. The rabbit was in the hole. She stood up, smiling, and placed the healthy baby in his mother's arms. The bodyguard, for the first time, looked at her not with suspicion, but with something approaching gratitude. He insisted she stay for tea, for dinner, for the night. It was too dangerous to travel in the dark. Jenna gracefully accepted, her body singing with adrenaline. She was inside the lion's den, and the lion had no idea. The beacon was a silent, pulsing star in the digital ether, a homing signal for death. For 3 days, and it transmitted its location to a satellite high overhead, which relayed the coordinates to a joint special operations command bunker half a world away. Jenna had returned to the village, her cover still intact, and continued her work as Sarah Harding, the saintly Canadian nurse. She waited. She knew the protocol. First, confirmation. Multiple intelligence streams would need to verify that the target was indeed in the compound. Then, the planning. The assault force, her brother's old unit, she suspected, would rehearse the raid on a simulated replica built from satellite imagery and her own verbal reports, which she had delivered in code during her subsequent routine visits to the village well. The waiting was the hardest part. Every creak of a door at night, every unfamiliar voice in the bazaar sent a spike of ice through her veins. One wrong look, one stray comment, and it would all be over. The assault came on the 4th night, under a new moon that turned the world into a pool of ink. Jenna was jolted awake by a sound so deep it was more of a physical sensation than a noise. The whoosh of hellfire missiles, followed by the deafening crump of explosions rocking the mountain. Then, the sky lit up. Tracer rounds arced through the darkness like angry fireflies, and the chatter of heavy machine guns echoed off the cliffs. The villagers poured out of their homes, clutching their children, their faces masks of fear. They looked to the mountain, to the firefight raging in their midst. Jenna stood among them, her face also a mask of fear, her hands trembling as if she were just another terrified aid worker. But her eyes were different, and they were tracking the trajectory of the flares, counting the seconds between explosions, judging the progress of the assault by the shifting sound of gunfire. It was a symphony of violence, and she was its composer. As suddenly as it started, it stopped. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the crackle of flames and the distant shouts of men. By dawn, the compound was a smoldering ruin. The bodyguard, the man whose wife she had saved, stumbled into the village hours later, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wild with grief and rage. He spoke of devils who had fallen from the sky, of fire that came from nowhere, of his master being dragged from the rubble. He looked at Jenna, the nurse, the healer, his wife's savior. She offered him water, her expression full of pity. He took it, his hands shaking, and oblivious to the fact that the woman who now comforted him was the very devil who had opened the gates of hell. Control had told her she would feel a sense of closure after this. She felt nothing. The debt to her brother was paid, but the ledger felt no lighter. The extraction was clinical and cold. 2 days after the raid, a UN relief convoy rolled through Mirkani. Jenna said her goodbyes to the villagers, accepting their tearful thanks for her help, their blessings for a safe journey home. She climbed into the back of a truck, and as the village disappeared in a cloud of dust, she stripped off the clothes of Sarah Harding and pulled on a nondescript flight suit. Within 48 hours, she was back in her cramped office in Norfolk, staring at a computer screen full of supply requisitions. Lieutenant Commander Evans poked his head in, asking if she'd had a nice family leave. She smiled and said it was fine, thanks for asking. He didn't ask for details. He never did. The raid was all over the news, a stunning success against a major terrorist figure. The talking heads praised the intelligence community and the bravery of the troops. They had no idea. No one mentioned the aid worker, the woman with the medical bag, the ghost in their midst. Jenna Blake, logistics officer, had just killed the man responsible for her brother's death, and the world would never know. She sat at her desk, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound, and felt the immense, crushing weight of her own anonymity. She was a weapon, and weapons weren't supposed to feel. But as she stared at the blank wall, she felt a single hot tear trace a path down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, the calloused hand of a seal, and got back to work. 6 months later, Jenna was called to a nondescript government building in Washington, D.C. She expected a debriefing, another layer of paperwork sealing the mission in a classified vault forever. Instead, she was led to a small conference room. Inside, waiting for her, was a man she didn't recognize at first. He was older, his hair thinner, his face etched with lines of worry and grief. He stood up as she entered, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that was unnerving. It was the bodyguard from the compound, the man whose son she had delivered. For a split second, her training took over. She assessed the threat. No visible weapons. No guards. This was a setup. But then the man spoke, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't immediately place. "They told me it was you," he said, his English halting but clear. "The men who came, they told me how they found us, about the device in the chest my wife keeps her most precious things in." He took a step closer, and Jenna braced herself for an attack, for an accusation, for anything but the tears that welled in his eyes. "You saved my son," he whispered. "You saved my wife, and then you destroyed my life." The room spun. This was a violation of every protocol, every security measure. How was he here? Why was he here? The answer came from the doorway, where Control now stood, his face unreadable. "He asked to see you, Jenna. He's been in our custody for months. He cooperated. He gave up names, locations, safe houses, all because of you." The man, his name, and she now remembered, was Fareed. looked at her, a storm of gratitude and hatred warring in his eyes. "I do not know what you are," he said to her. "Are you an angel of mercy or a demon of war? You came to my home with healing hands and you left with a curse. My master is dead. My brothers are dead. But my son lives because of those hands. I cannot hate you, and I cannot forgive you." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jenna standing in a silence that was more deafening than any explosion. Control explained that Farid had been granted a form of protected status in exchange for his intelligence. He had asked, as his one irrational request, to see the woman who had been both his family's salvation and its damnation. It was a psychological profile the CIA couldn't resist. As Jenna listened, she realized that the walls she had built around herself, the walls that had allowed her to survive BUD/S, to walk alone into that compound, to place the beacon and feel nothing, had just developed a hairline fracture. The mission was over. The target was dead. But the consequences, the human wreckage of her secret war, were standing right in front of her. She returned to Norfolk, but the old life no longer fit. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the small talk of her colleagues more unbearable. She was a ghost who had been seen, a weapon that had been thanked by the very people it was designed to destroy. The final twist came a week later. She was summoned to the Admiral's office, a place she had never been. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man who commanded the entire naval special warfare community. He looked at her for a long moment, and then slid a single sheet of paper across his desk. It was a promotion warrant, but not for a higher rank in logistics. It was a direct commission to lieutenant with a new designation, Special Operations. Her cover was blown, but not in the way she feared. They weren't putting her back in the box. They were promoting her out of it. "You proved something out there, Blake," the Admiral said, his voice a low rumble. "You proved that the most dangerous weapon we have isn't always the one with the biggest gun. Sometimes, it's the one no one sees coming. Welcome to the real world." Jenna Blake, the girl who had become a SEAL to avenge her brother, had just become the architect of a new kind of warfare. She had no idea that her legend had just begun. But for the first time since Liam died, and as she walked out of the Admiral's office into the pale Virginia sunlight, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt seen.